this is my attempt to get us back to normal. You know, you think about 2 years ago, it was commonplace for somebody to stand at this podium and speak to a live person. So this is kind of exciting, but it is still a work in progress. So we will be looking for feedback from those of you that are attending remotely, as well as those of you that are in the room. If there are aspects of this hybrid meeting format that do or don't work, please let us know. Again, what we want to do is be here to serve you as well. So talking about transportation funding, you know, when it comes to transportation funding, we could spend days really talking about the complexities, the programs, the details. So I just want to start by reminding everybody that this particular conversation is intended to be a part of our discussion series. So it's within that context that I'm going to be talking about transportation. And the discussion series is intended to bring along folks that maybe are new to politics or new to these sorts of discussions in transportation funding, to inform everyone, to open up a dialogue and exchange, solicit feedback, not only from our board, but from our advisory committees, because we're giving these presentations to them as well. To discuss the screening criteria that we use to evaluate projects, rank them, potential metrics that might help better inform everybody, and to identify strategies that ultimately are going to lead SRTC to be a more successful organization. So if we think about our unified list, funding in and of itself is not a criteria, but let's face it, it's the point of the process to identify projects that are needed and then to try to successfully access the funding that might be available. In the end, we're trying to goals, we're trying to support our member partners. So the unified list provides us with a really important tool that helps us communicate what our regional priorities are, what our member governments are trying to pursue, and to help those member governments advance these projects. So this is one mechanism that helps our member governments achieve their goals. But again, it is more effective if we can use this to help leverage funding in other areas, especially at the state and federal level. So this is the 6th presentation in our discussion series, and you can see by this chart in white are the ones that have occurred here in this June meeting. And what we're heading towards is an update of the unified list sometime in the fall timeframe. We want to get into this cycle, hopefully, so that when there is a legislative session and there's going to be action taken, we have a solid current list of information that we can bring forward and use. And hopefully our partners in the community will be using as well. So let me just start by talking a little bit about the role of transportation in general, right? It has big, lofty responsibilities. You heard the senator mention it earlier. It contributes to national security. We have a network of highways called the STRAYNet, the Strategic Highway Network. And that's what allows mobilization of our military forces, right? We support transportation in the US and the world economy. We makes up almost 10% of our annual GDP, just the demand for transportation. So it's a big deal. But it also has impacts on what are relatively smaller but super important aspects of our lives, right? How our kids get to and from school, how our parents, as they age, are getting to and from their medical appointments and maintaining a quality of life, how we get to work, to meetings like this every day. So transportation is important, but we recognize that high quality transportation, that is a system that is reliable and resilient, is expensive, right? The amount of money that is spent to develop and maintain the transportation system is very significant. You'll see on the next slide, and we all are pretty well aware that the amount of money in the federal budget, the new IIJA, is significant, over $500 billion. in a 5-year period. And of course, we all are aware of Move Ahead Washington package. But if we think about the Spokane region, we recognize that we have unique challenges that are expensive to try and deal with. We have rivers to cross, right? Bridging across a river is much, much more expensive than a lane mile of highway on the ground. We have rail lines that cross through our planning area, and we have to go over them or under them. And if there are at-grade crossings, we have to deal with safety issues and congestion delays that come along with that. We also have harsh winters that take a toll on the roads, and we have to deal with that maintenance and preservation. So what are the revenue sources that we deal with and that are available for transportation? We know there's the federal, state, and local level. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the federal level, which is where MPOs really have a more germane role. At the federal level, we generate revenue pennies per gallon. And I think everybody here is aware we have 24 cents roughly on diesel, 18 on gas. And that accounts in a typical year for about 85 to 90% of the total transportation budget at the federal level. Now, under IIJA, that's a little different because there are other funds that it's supplemented. But that gas tax hasn't been updated since 1993, right? So the conversation came up a little earlier when the senator was here. We're losing ground. Inflation has almost led to a doubling in prices since 1983. Not quite, but almost. So we have lost a lot of ground. On top of that, cars are becoming more fuel efficient, electric vehicles. So we're definitely not keeping pace with what is needed to maintain our system and expand our system. Now, when you think about 18 cents a gallon, if you do the math, depending on how much you drive each year, you're really talking about $100 or $150 per vehicle. It's really not that significant in terms of the amount of money that people pay for the benefit. Now, there's state fuel taxes on top of that. But on a federal level, that's not so significant. And when we talk about the state budget, we also use pennies per gallon, but the pennies per gallon is just one of many revenue sources. There are other fees and tolls, and in this last package, general revenue. So there are other mechanisms that go into the transportation budget, and that's a good thing, right? Not all the eggs are in one basket, so to speak. The state legislature has also updated that. So last updated in 2016. So here in the state, keeping current, or at least relatively current with inflation. Now, some of those pennies are already targeted, right? They have to go to bond repayment. So not all of the revenue that's generated at a state level is always available for new activities. They're available for obligations that are already in place. And then at the local level, I don't have to tell you all are probably very familiar with the variety of sources that you use locally. What's important to keep in mind is how we have access to these dollars, and then also how we're able to potentially leverage federal funds with state funds and local funds. When I talk about local funds, I'm also talking about the private sector funds that are made available to pay for their impacts of new development that are sometimes collected by local governments. So I want to go into a little bit of detail about the IIJA and federal funding. Just a quick reminder, when we collect federal funds, it goes into the Highway Trust Fund. The Highway Trust Fund then uses different transportation authorization bills or acts, MAP 21, the FAST Act, to distribute that money. About 90% of the money is distributed through formula funds. And then about 10% are those discretionary programs that are hotly competed for. So if we want to focusing on the formula funds is probably an important thing to do. You may remember from last month's board meeting, when formula funds are distributed to a state, then the state goes through a discussion here in Washington to split those funds between state and local entities. And so the Joint Transportation Committee they just met yesterday for their first meeting, and they're going to discuss the splits of the existing programs and the new programs. And Mayor Freeman has been appointed as the primary representative, and Councilmember Zappone is an alternate to that committee. So that's important work to pay attention to over the next couple of months. So the IIJA, or bill, the bipartisan infrastructure, it was much larger than usual. And the reason for that, or the reason that that opportunity existed, was there were unused COVID funds and some other programs that money was taken from and repurposed to contribute to this infrastructure package. And the goal of the infrastructure package, or at least the increases, in large part are to help repair the aging infrastructure, to take care of some of the needs that exist. So if you look at the chart on the next page, you'll see, and my apologies, this is a lot of information. The packages or the presentation will be available if you want to look through this, if you haven't already seen this information. But what you see on this particular chart are all of the different programs. And if you're curious about the programs, let us know. We can walk through what some of those are. But everything at the top of the list, not in the gray shaded area, are programs that already exist. And you can see the difference between what was funded in the 5-year FAST Act and then what is funded in the IIJA. And the difference, Colin, is pretty significant. The 4 projects at the bottom are new programs, and there is still some guidance that is coming out on these. But I think with the JTC working group, this is probably where we're going to spend most of our time talking about some of these new programs and how to split those. So I'm going to leave it at that on terms of federal funding and shift gears to the state level. And I won't spend a lot of time on this slide because I think all of you are well aware of the process that we use here in Washington for the state to put together a multi-year funding package. So I'm just going to go ahead and go on to recognize that a part of what we're trying to do at SRTC is communicate well with both of our state and federal legislators to make sure that they understand what the needs of this region are and how we work collaboratively to develop those priority lists. And we do that with a couple of documents. Our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, that's our longer range plan. That's really where most of these conversations start. Then we move projects and projects that fit into programmatic buckets in that plan into a transportation improvement program. That's where we start actually funding projects. And then ultimately we have a unified priority list that is talking about the projects that are priorities for this area. So as we move towards updating this unified list, I think it's important to be cognizant of the environment that we're working in, right? So we have substantial funding opportunities in the near term under the IIJA. We have very limited funding over the longer range. So how do we position ourselves with this unified list to take advantage of these projects in the near term, but not overextend? Because when the bill is over, I think we're going to be challenged, right? Because we're not going to have dollars to repurpose anymore. How do we deal with the needs that we have in an area that's still growing rapidly? And then how do we balance that with maintenance and preservation needs that we have? So So I want to ask a few questions of this board to make sure that we're on the right track as staff in supporting what you want. And the first is, what sort of attributes and what sort of processes would be helpful for you in identifying our highest value solutions? So one of the tasks we've been talking about is developing a needs analysis, really doing a strong needs analysis of the system so that we can identify where we have challenges and what those solutions might be in addressing those challenges. Do we need to look at technology? Do you understand, or would you like to see what sort of technology solutions would help us get more out of our existing system? Because all of these are going to factor into either the development of the unified list or studies that we need to undertake in order to continue to make that a better list. So I'm throwing that out there to you all right now to give me some input on what you would like to see come from staff to help with this next iteration or a future iteration of the list of priority projects. I can't see the hands that are raised, so I'm going to rely on somebody else, but I can see Betsy's hand literally raised.
Literally. So as a fairly new elected, I think overall develop analysis of what is needed for the region. And as new electeds come in, I think I have missed or playing catch up on really where the gaps that need to be filled, whether it's in the city of Spokane or Cheney or the Valley, that makes the most sense to get people to move. And I don't have that knowledge, or I haven't seen the big picture of that. And then how would that play into STA? So for me, I need something visual and more in depth from an experienced planner perspective to help make better decisions, just taking a political posture as we make decisions.
So what happens sometimes is, right, we go through a long range planning effort where we do something similar or we do it a needs analysis. We didn't do that in the last update, so it's been a while. But what happens on the interim is there are various planning studies that occur. And then there are recommendations that come out of those planning studies. And those recommendations are the right recommendations for that one area. But that doesn't necessarily explain how it fits into the entire region. And so then we have to try to figure out how to fit those studies together. And so a more broad needs analysis is a little more proactive in identifying those priorities early on. I agree, man.
Was there anybody else out there? I don't want to, just because I'm in person.
You got the floor right now.
Okay.
Oh,
I would piggyback on what Betsy's saying, and then to some extent what Ms. Bukai was saying is in the holistic approach in which we evaluate what we're bringing to the table for funding, for projects, for analysis. I think one of the things is that in the plan, for the planning stage, what you're talking about, a needs analysis is there, but I think for some of us as elected, needs actually are impacts. What can we implement that has the greatest amount of impact? And we know we have needs, but when we're trying to prioritize, what sort of impact are we getting for the dollars that we're competing for? And I think one of the things, and I was glad to see that you presented something like this BNSF, the Grade Separation Project for Pines, because that's a sort of project that for Valley fills a very specific need for them. But in completing these portions of bridging the Valley, that has a far greater impact than simply for the Valley. That eliminates, the more that we can work, and I'll just use this as an example, the more that we can work toward completing a project like bridging the Valley, the more strain we take off of other freight mobility issues in Spokane. The more that the overarching goal of that was to move UP main freight onto that BN corridor. If we can get bridging the valley done, we eliminate a lot of the issues with these mainline UP trains that are running through Valley, Millwood, Spokane. And so the impact of completing these grade separation projects at Barker, at Pines, other places, extends far beyond just the economic impact or the impact for Valley. I think that sort of overall downstream impact analysis for these types of projects, but might help us better prioritize and better work together as a cohesive group when we're going to our legislators saying, this is a project, these funds, whether it be state funds or local funds, as we're talking about with the JTC, what do those funds come from? And not necessarily out of one pot or the other pot, either state pot or local pot, because the overall impacts actually work on the whole system. And so it really shouldn't matter where the money comes from, because the impact is much farther reaching than simply a grade separation project at Pines.
And I think, again, it came up today as we were touring around the area, and it is what led to the development of these fact sheets that we're trying to put together to back up, right? If somebody doesn't want to read the 196-page study, but they want to understand the story or the value meaning of this particular project, you name it, any project on that list. And so what we're trying to do is create that opportunity for somebody from GSI or the Valley Chamber or our TAC or any of our members to bring these forward when they're speaking with funding partners to say, here it is. And we're all speaking from the same page. So anybody on remote that has a thought that they'd like to share?
And the board members regarding comment with identifying our priorities on funding. I'm sorry, Sonny, Councilmember Weather.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Yeah, I just want to give maybe a diplomatic approach here. I love the comments that were shared, and I'd echo them as well. And I just think it's kind of this tricky balance point between as a part-time elected official who cares passionately about meaningful projects and how we rate them and how we fund them. What I hope for is a very objective framework that makes it really easy for me to just kind of look and say, yep, all these things matter, and this one has 7 boxes checked and that one has 4 boxes checked, and that'd be fantastic. But I think in reality, when we're looking at these projects, what tends to be, it's like a complicated sports event, and the stats are flexible, right? It's, who knows who's going to score how many points or get how many assists or how many rebounds. And so each of these projects will get different values in different ways. But I think if we have kind of, I don't know, it's like the skin and the skeleton. We need the structure of a framework that helps us with our priorities and the impacts and, traffic counts and road miles or, whatever it is, proximity to employment, the overall maintenance costs, things like that, along with, some of those hidden impacts. Depending on what it is, but I would share that I love the approach of the 2-pagers because it helps smaller jurisdictions to really sell the value of their projects as well. We don't have necessarily communications directors and PR staffs that can really put together a great looking package with all those details and all the right buzzwords. And so the assistance that the SRTC has provided us in Airway Heights anyway has been invaluable. We really appreciate that. I think the other thing it does is it really helps tie all these regional projects together, even though there's different agencies and partners involved, and it's everything's important, but it's not all equally important. So I hope that wasn't too gummed up, but
Very good. Thank you. Anybody else?
I guess I didn't raise my hand.
I
Still not,
recognize
Cooper.
still not quick enough on the button, sorry. I agree with all the other statements. I just wanted to chime in and let you know I do agree with
Yeah,
those.
we're on with council tomorrow, huh? Okay. So
All
the
right.
ones that I wrote down,
A little bit short on time,
Okay,
so I
that
want to
we're
move
gonna
to
hang on
the next
to
question.
is the Kiefer wastewater lagoon welcome it. And civil and architecture for,
there we go. We need to have, Mayor Cooper, did you finish your comment? I'm sorry.
I did not, but I can wait if somebody else was talking first.
Nope, go ahead. You have the floor.
I'm sorry. So I was just going to say that I agree with all the other comments that were made. The notes that I made are, I think it's important, and you probably already do this, but just looking through as you do your processes, you know, we have commerce, those different lenses. So commerce and employment and education and recreation and medical and public safety, and how does all the transportation, there's just a different lens, there's a different kind of transportation movement happening. And then considering the future growth, especially, you know, the West Plains being the voice, probably the smallest voice out here, one of them, but just saying that the future growth, looking through that lens, that whatever projects are happening with all of the rapid growth that's happening with the manufacturing and all the building that's coming out here and the housing that's going to be expanding out here, how we interconnect regionally is going to be really important. And so I hope that there will be a great deal of emphasis put on the entire movement, not just, you know, small sections. So sometimes it's easy, I think, to fund those big projects, but maybe seeing how we're all connected is going to be really important. And I know how much you've helped Airway Heights, and I know you're going to help us too, and Sheeny. So we're all coming into this kind of together, or I'm new to the table for sure, but I just really appreciate the thoughts of what is the process. And I think the process needs to have a really high level look at how it's all working together. So.
Very good. Thank you, Mayor Cooper.
Well, and to
Lois-
Mayor Cooper's point, having a variety of projects is really important. And I think you see that reflected on our unified list now. Large projects and small projects, trail projects and sidewalk projects, transit projects. It does need to be a diverse set of projects for sure. I want to move to the next item, and I don't know if Councilmember French is still on, but I think this is okay. So near and dear to his heart and feedback that he's provided, Julie, we can't quite see the question, which is how can SRTC be more flexible and current? So I mentioned our MTP is only updated every so often. Our call for projects is every so often. But things change quickly. So are there some things that we can do? And again, so I would like confirmation, because I have in my head that we need to go through this process, update this list and this package, this communication package annually. Would I be on track with that? Is that something the board would like to see? And is there anything else that you think we can do? You know, we're a long range planning organization. So for elected officials that are very action oriented, long range planning sometimes is hard. And I get that. But we want to be current, and we want to be helpful, and we want to have products that are current. And so again, in my mind, pulling together packages, not quite like this, but similar, updating our project information and staying on top of it on an annual basis is something that I think is probably important. Is there anything else that strikes you all as an activity that we need to do.
Councilmember Wilkerson.
Well, I'll just say that that model, every 4 years or every few years, is probably effective at the time. But we realize now that things change and funding sources are changing rapidly. So if we're just kind of waiting around to stay in our own space of what we do, still long-range planning, but I think it's beneficial that we're updated more than once every 4 years, whatever that looks like. That we just have to be, or we won't be current enough to be making the best decisions that are coming down the pipe.
Good, thank you. Councilmember Higgins.
How often are inflation statistics updated?
Annually.
No, monthly. I'm not advocating we do that. We're in a very fluid world.
Yeah, yes,
4 years is too long.
that's too long.
Yeah, so a metropolitan plan, a transportation plan is a long-range plan, and it takes a lot of work. You know, it can take 18 months to 2 years to update, a lot of public outreach. But if there's a mechanism, and we can talk about that internally, how do we go back and look at that to make sure that it is still reflective and we're not losing ground? You can always amend it if there's a project that's missing. But certainly working, when we do the long range plan and then we complete corridor studies in between, and I think we're running into this a little bit with Airway Heights and other projects. Projects come up, Inland Empire Way, and then they're not reflective in our long range plan and our materials because they've happened since that update. So some type of mechanism where we can keep those a little more current. Now, adding to the list doesn't necessarily help us achieve completion of projects that were already on the list. So, there's that consideration as well, but we certainly want to stay current in a fast moving world. Let me just move real quickly to our last question. And that is, how can we be more successful in meeting the needs? And when I say the needs, I really mean in advancing projects that we find on our list. We're certainly working on partnering as much as possible. Should we be looking at new revenue sources? Should we be developing communication tools like this? Where do you believe SRTC can be the most helpful in this area?
Anyone?
Just quick question.
Councilmember Wilkerson.
Could you just give me an example of when you say, should we develop or promote new revenue resources? Give me an example of what you're talking about there.
Should we assist with funding studies we talked about the road user charge, right? We know that in the longer run, we are going to have a problem. Do we need to start to look at how that's going to impact that area or this area in more meaningful ways, and then take positions on activities like the road user charge? Do we need to help promote things like taxi benefit districts, TIPs, or other local mechanisms? The odds of us having a huge impact at the federal level, it's been since 1993 and nobody's cracked that nut yet. I don't think we're going to do that. So the question is, where can we affect change with regards to revenue, right? Because at the end of the day, this is a supply and demand issue. We either have to have greater revenues so that we can increase the supply, or we need to start to look at how we can manage the demand. That's it. But we're a staff of 10, so we only have so much opportunity. The question is, where do we spend our time?
I was just gonna say, I do think, given our relationship with Kootenai County, we definitely need to be prepared to be an advocate if we are going to change funding streams. We need to be an advocate that works best for whatever that funding stream is we need to be the advocate for the funding stream that works best for us. Because if we have a number of vehicles registered in Kootenai County, people buying their gas in Kootenai County, people living in Kootenai County, people driving here for work or whatever, and then going back, we have no way under any current, at least right now, under any current discussion, to capture their use of our roads. And so I do think that at this level, if we don't see a solution being advocated or being developed that fits our particular need or our particular circumstance, we need to be prepared to investigate that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think certainly in like the Vancouver area, that's an issue as well. What happens with people that are crossing state lines? How do we manage that revenue stream? Any other thoughts? Anybody online?
Anybody else have a hand up? This final question? If not, I think do you want to conclude or is?
That was my last question and my last slide. So
Good discussion. Thank you, Lois. That was.
thank you all.
And with that, I think that's a great segue, funding that is, into item number 10. That's a 2024-2026 CIP call for projects. Ms. Kylie Jones, you have the floor.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm going to